Will the West Virginia Mountaineers be able to compete in today's new world of college athletics? Well, I'm going to ask the man himself, Athletic Director Wren Baker. In this upcoming interview, we talk about that and a whole lot more. So stick around and hear what Wren had to say right after this word from our sponsor. Since 1931, the attorneys at Katz, Cantor, Stone Street, and Buckner have been the voice for victims who have suffered serious injury or death. They have a fierce passion for truth and justice and a sincere compassion for those who have been wronged by others. Whether you have been in a car accident or fighting with an insurance company, or you or a loved one has suffered serious injury or death due to medical negligence, we will ensure your voice is heard loud and clear. Katz, Cantor, Stone Street, and Buckner will ensure there is justice for all West Virginians because we are your lawyer, your voice. Visit us at yourlawyeryourvoice.com. What is up? Come on in, make yourself comfortable, belly yourself up to the bar, and let me pour you out another shot of top shelf college football content. I'm very excited to bring you this episode today, as I'm very honored and privileged to have West Virginia's Vice President and Director of Athletics, Wren Baker, on the show. We cover a lot of ground in this interview. I had a lot more questions I could have asked Wren, but I wanted to respect his time. So stick around, enjoy. Here he is, Wren Baker. Let's jump for a second to the House case. Obviously, the big news came out last week about the settlement that was, I guess, the NCAA and the Power Four conferences have agreed to, and I guess handed over to the courts for approval. I hope I'm describing that accurately. Waiting on the courts to decide whether to approve it or not. But it's basically there's back pay that goes to former athletes. There's obviously revenue sharing that's going to go to current and future athletes, and every program has an opportunity to increase their scholarship numbers. So when you look at the totality of that thing, is West Virginia going to be able to, I guess, meet all of those? Are they going to be able to max out, I guess, would be a better way to word it.
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about the settlement first, and I'll circle back to us and how we're viewing it. So traditionally, college athletics has used the revenues from football and basketball, but primarily football, to fund an entire athletic department. And so a lot of people don't realize this, and this will come up sometimes when people ask me, could we ever add this sport or that sport? I get asked about softball a lot, and they're like, well, we know you would make money. Like, there'd be a lot of people come out and buy tickets. Would there be revenues? Yes. Would it be profitable? No. And how do I know that? There's not a profitable softball program in the country. There's not one program that generates enough revenue to pay the expense. And when you add scholarships, travel, equipment, coaching salaries, all of those things up. And so, and that's not just softball. That's pretty much every sport except for football and men's basketball.
Right.
And many of our sports, if the coaches worked for free, if they were volunteer, those sports, would be loss leaders in terms of expenses being greater than revenues. And so that's been that way for a long time. But what's happened over time is the revenues, primarily TV revenues, have grown exponentially, and that's caused budgets to grow exponentially. And so as people felt pressure on campuses to win, they weren't allowed to pay players, so they paid coaches. And that metric really got out of whack and caused a lot of criticism, and really caused a lightning rod at colleges for how could you pay all these coaches all this money? How could you pay coaches to not coach because you're guaranteeing them these multi-year contracts, and the student athletes are still just getting a scholarship. I think lost in all that is the value of a scholarship, the value of being admitted into college, and how much you grow as a person during that time, and then your overall marketability and ability to make money after leaving college. But take that aside, I do understand the criticism that comes with, your budgets have grown by 5, 6, 7, 800% over the last 20 years. There should be more benefits for student athletes, and they have gotten more benefits, right? I mean, not only now do they get full scholarship, they get cost of attendance. We do Austin academic awards. We feed them the best meals that are fed on campus are served our student athletes through our training table. And so, we now have full-time nutritionists. You just go on and on. It's the best sports experience in the world. In many cases, we do more than the pro teams do. But the courts have consistently said that legally we cannot arbitrarily set this cap on benefits provided to student athletes, particularly those in those revenue sports, and just funnel it, whether that's paying coaches' salaries or using it to fund. I'll use women's golf because we don't have women's golf, a women's golf program. All right, and so. And so we just reached a crescendo where the legal system says what you're doing is not illegal. So if you go back the last couple of years, there's been a lot of talk about trying to get some antitrust protection from Congress, really to protect Olympic sports. We have not been able to do that. And part of the reason we hadn't been able to do that is because they're saying, well, even if we give you some kind of limited antitrust protection, like the revenue sports student athletes should be entitled to more. So this settlement represents, and if you ask 100 ADs and 100 presidents, what do you think about the settlement? They all could cherry pick and nuance things they don't like. There's a lot of things in the settlement that I don't agree with, but it represents a compromise on a variety of fronts to try to settle the back damages. So all those years where we had rules prohibiting NIL, all those years where we had some very restrictive rules on different policies. So there's a back damages piece of that, and then there's a go forward that's a permissive cap. So you're not required to do it; you're allowed to do it of a rev share, and that number right now would be somewhere around $22-23 million.
Okay,
and so that's a significant amount of money. I already mentioned, so our budget this year will be I think about $105 million. That's a lot of money. And I know people hear that number, they're like, man, that's massive. But again, when you take out travel and debt service, it's the lowest in the Big 12. And so, when you're trying to compete, you're adding 20 million on top of that, you can see the challenge that we'll have. But we have always risen to the challenge. And so we most definitely will be competitive in this new environment. We're spending all of our time every day. I'm probably spending 80-90% of my days walking through, hey, here's how we can do this. Here's how we can figure this out. Now back to the roster limits and people automatically construing that to additional scholarships. So I think college athletic leaders, commissioners knew the next thing that would be challenged was the scholarship limits. So why does a baseball team that would carry 40 people only have 11.7? Well, they have 11.7 because years ago we decided for cost containment, that we would assign these arbitrary numbers. And then also we would try to balance Title IX through those numbers. So a lot of people don't realize this. Men's basketball gets 13 scholarships. Women's basketball gets 15. Right?
I noticed that. Yeah.
Yeah. And so the reason why that's the way it is they were trying to balance Title IX. So same thing in golf, same thing in pretty much every men and women's sport. The women are going to get more scholarships than the men because there is no women's football to offset those football numbers. So you're trying to offset that. But what they know is, if you were to be called in the court and say, why this 11.7, there isn't probably a legally defensible reason why that's in place. So, but what you can do is set a roster limit, because that's a competitive thing that the NCAA has guidance over. And so they're going to go away from scholarship limits and go to roster limits. How you divvy that up. So that doesn't mean that you have to go out and add a bunch of scholarships. And in fact, if you go add scholarships, the first $2.5 million worth you add is going to count against that cap. So that'll give you less money for rev share. So every institution's got to make a lot of tough decisions on where they're going to put their money. And if you immediately go from the 85 in football to the 105, well, that's an addition of 20. If you stack some, let's say that you ended up going to 35 in baseball. Now you've added 13 or 23 there. So that's 43. Well, you're going to have to go and add that, at least that on the women's side. And everybody's ratio is different, right? But what Title IX says is, if your campus ratio is 55% women, then your athlete head count and your athlete scholarship should be 55% women. So it's likely that you would not just have to add 43, but you would have to add 43 plus the percentage required to stay in line. And so that's going to, I don't know that everybody's going to immediately go and do that. Because I don't think that financially that's going to be real feasible, and it's going to work against you when it comes to that cap. And somebody who doesn't, it's going to have more money to share. And so we're spending a lot of time running a lot of models. But as I told our staff, we don't even yet know like the actual rev share NIL payments. If those are Title IX applicable or not. You go on social media and you're going to see both opinions out there today. Like you can find 25 lawyers that'll say it's not and 25 that'll say it is. And so what we need to focus on right now is just getting as much money in the door as we can for rev share, and knowing that there's a lot of expenses coming. And then we'll get clarity as the year goes along on how that can be done and the best way for us to implement it. But I do think it's important for us to try to maintain. I don't know that we can go out and improve the experience of all of our sports, but I don't want to cut sports, and I don't want to cut what we're providing in those sports. And so we're going to try and at least maintain what I've told our coaches. I'm going to do everything I can to hold you harmless, to not take away from you. And then when we look at our revenue sports, that's where our focus will be initially on, because that's where the return is, and really that's what's going to feed everybody else as we move forward. And so we'll focus there first on making sure that we are competitive with what our peer institutions are doing.
Okay. Yeah, because there was a belief, or there is a belief by many out there, and it's not, I don't want to say a belief, but a question, I guess, concern, as if you get these increased scholarships, that the quote unquote blue blood programs of the world will go out here and just stockpile players. But it sounds to me like the way you're describing it, that may not happen, because if they do that, then that's less they're going to be able to revenue share. So I wasn't aware that the scholarships, I thought the scholarships were in addition to the revenue share, but you're saying it's actually part of that overall number.
Up to $2.5 million is. Now let's just say that you're Ohio State, you have 37 sports and you fully fund all of those. My guess is that would be a $6 or $7 million addition to them. And only 2.5 of that counts. 2.5 million counts. But anything you do in Austin, which we currently do about $1.5 million in Austin, counts against that cap. And anything new scholarship wise counts against that cap. And so, and Austin, I think, is up to 2.5 million too. We just don't quite do 2.5. But if you're Ohio State, I bet they're already doing 2.5 million in Austin money. Then you add these scholarships, that's 2.5 million. So your number is not 22 million. Your number is 17 million.
Right.
Because you got to count. You got to count that against the cap. And so there's going to be a lot of nuance into how everybody handles it differently. You go down to LSU, for instance. Football is a big deal there. Women's basketball is a big deal there. Baseball is a monster deal there. They got, men's basketball. So like you're going to have to, every time you pull a lever, it's going to impact other levers. And intertwined in all of this is, as you've seen much debate on social media, is how the NIL and the collectives and all that gets regulated. The plan is to try and make that true market-based, commercial, organic NIL, not donors paying for play. But how that ultimately happens, and the fact that it's in that settlement, provided it stays in. I mean, it's a legally binding thing. It's not an NCAA thing. It's a judicial, legal settlement. And so that's why when they talk about the regulation piece being outside the NCAA potentially, like a third party, that's why that would be there, because that third party would be in charge of making sure everything is legal. But how the actual details of how that works will be a monster piece of all this conversation.
Yeah. It looks like they're trying to get, a lot of people think they're trying to get rid of collectives altogether. Is that fair?
I think at least the pay for play, unregulated piece, yes.
Okay.
No, and the reality is nobody feels like ADs and coaches have been put in a tough spot, and ours actually works great because we have a great relationship with Country Roads Trust. They do what they say they're going to do. Ken Kendrick and fellow Princeton guy is, because you're Princeton, if I remember correctly.
I am.
You?
I am. Yes, sir.
And so he and Oliver and Stephen Ford and that crew do a really good job of making sure that that everything is on the up and up. But there are a lot of places where young people are being um, forced or promised something, and
Mhm.
then not it's not being delivered, and then the schools really have no power to ensure that
Mhm.
that's delivered. And so I think generally people would, if we're going to do revenue share, everybody is like, hey, let's do it, but let's try and pull this back in where this is a more regulated environment.
Got it. Makes sense. Let's switch gears a minute. I know there's been a lot of talk around, and I heard you on the Three Guys Before the Game show the other day. They asked you about private equity, and you said you don't think there'll be private equity at a conference level for 20 in the next 2 years, but you do think schools may do it. Has West Virginia kicked the tires on private equity?
Yeah, we explore everything that's out there in the market. Like I always am wanting to know more about about
Mhm.
what's going on. I'm not sure that we're close to doing it. And I should probably clarify my remarks. Tony, and if you go back and if you watch that, you saw me kind of contemplate a little bit before I answered. But the
Yep.
question was the next 18 to 24 months.
Right. Right.
Um, and and I answered that more of if I was laying odds on yes or no,
Mhm.
where I thought it would end up, just because I know like the broad consensus you would have to have, and I'm not sensing that right now.
Right.
But I private equity sees value in college sports. Obviously, they're making a lot of overtures and trying to explore different inroads to get into it. But private equity is all about making money, and we do a lot of things. Like I just mentioned to you, we have two sports on this campus that are profitable,
Yep.
right?
Mhm.
Um, so if private equity comes in, they're trying to drive up profits. And so what does that mean for the experience of all of our other sports? That's a great question. And but they don't, that money isn't for free.
Right.
And generally private equity, they target a 20% annual return. Well, if they're targeting 20% annual return, they're trying to drive up your revenues, drive down your expenses, and you're having to do that because you're having to make sure that that money that you took that is getting that return. Usually there's some
Right.
safeguards in there for them. And so it's something that's worth exploring, something that we'll continue to keep an eye on. But I don't know that it's something that people are in a rush to do, because I think most people understand um, at that point we would have moved completely away from this broad-based um, athletic experience where you're trying to provide a lot of
Mhm.
programs, and you would be headed down a path of a more professionalized, maybe fully professionalized type environment.
Right. Thank you for answering that. I got one more question I have been dying to ask you, and I know we're pushing up on time for you to get out of here, but I got to ask you this question. I've heard you and Neil both talk about scheduling in football multiple times. You talked about how you would like to move away from playing two Power Five teams and add an extra G5 game in there maybe to get that extra home game, and also not, maybe not be so physically demanding on the players and all that. But now that we're moving in, my theory is, and I want to get your thoughts on it. My theory is now that we're in a 12-team playoff model, and it's uh, especially now that the SEC and Big Ten are pushing to try to get reportedly pushing to try to get more of their teams in the playoff, right down the road, for the Big 12 to make sure they can get at least two teams in every year. Wouldn't it be more important than ever to have that strength of schedule, or is the focus just going to be on winning the league and getting in that way? Uh, to me, I'm thinking in my head, moving away from the two Power Five teams may have worked in the four-team model, but maybe in the 12-team model, it's not the greatest idea. But I wanted to get your thoughts as the AD on that.
Yeah, I think part of that comes down to that final CFP format and how those selections are made.
Hmm.
If our conference is assigned multiple bids, I don't think you'd want to do anything that would hurt your chances of winning the conference championship. And
Okay.
so, and that's still probably your best path to get, if there's 16 teams in it, if ultimately, 6 to 8 of those spots are ate up by two conferences, and you got everybody else vying, for 8, and then, like I just think, the key to success is are you setting yourself up to be highly competitive and have a chance to play in your conference championship game?
Okay.
And so, and then also think like that number of conference games factors into that. But if you're playing 9 and you have leagues that are playing 8, that strength of schedule is already built in.
Okay.
And probably the last thing I would say is I think you have to be careful about overscheduling. I think like you look at some of the schedules that we've had the last few years, they were built on the idea of trying to create a tougher strength of schedule, and they've not been real successful seasons for us.
Right.
And so I just think you have to set yourself up for a schedule that provides some challenges in the non-conference, gives your fans at least one really, really good Power 5 opponent that everybody is super fired up about. That FCS game, I've spoke about this before, that game is important because it ensures that you're always going to have at least 6 and hopefully 7 home games. And
right.
I could go back to the stats on how much better we perform at home, but the more that we can play at home, the better chance we have success, and it also holds down our costs because you take
Correct.
that road trip off.
Right.
And so that really leaves your debate in one game. Do you try and find a good group of 5 opponent? A lot of times you can get them at home and buy them, or at worst case, a 2-for-1. Or do you stay in a non-conference Power 5 home and home? And I just believe, and this isn't a guess. Like I've went through and looked at every team, the Kansas States. You go like anybody whose team has been on the come up, right, and gotten better. In almost all of those cases, they had a schedule that was set up for them to be able to come out of it with a winning non-conference record. And so. Listen, for the athletic director, like this Penn State game is going to make a ton of money. The Pitt game makes a ton of money. Like being at home and homes with both of those teams, like we would sell a lot of tickets every year because just having those games on the schedule is going to bring people out. But you got to balance that with giving your team the best chance to be healthy, to have confidence, to be able to build into a season and have a chance for success down the stretch.
Well, listen, I know you have other things to get to. I did have other questions for you, but I'll save that for next time. Wren, I really appreciate you again coming on the show. Everybody go check if you want to interact with Wren. He's very active on Twitter, by the way, or X. He's at Wren Baker. Very easy. You didn't make your handle complicated, did you?
I didn't. I grabbed that one like 13, 14 years ago, so I was able to commandeer it, and I've just kept it all this time. So
that's awesome. Well, listen, thanks again for coming on the show. It's been a huge privilege to talk to you, and good luck this season.
Hey, I appreciate it, and thanks to all the loyal Mountaineers across the state, but especially there in Southern West Virginia. I always love visiting. He actually got me to do this at the caravan at Glade Springs. So like you get me face to face, and it's hard for me to say no. So
I cornered him.
Yeah, he did.
He couldn't get away.
We're excited. We're excited. You had your dad with you too. You brought backup. Yeah,
I did. Yeah, Dad was with me.
All right, appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you, Wren. Take care of yourself.
You too.